Okay, so this week I want to go over stuff to do with web typography. I got notes up on my website in the usual place, DXB 301 Tutorials Week 9. It'll also be the top post on the front of the page. The reason I want to go over web typography is because I think often it's overlooked, particularly when you consider that the majority of content that we consume on the web, even today in the age of lots of multimedia, most of what we consume on the internet is still going to be text. Okay, some people will say up to 95% of the content that we consume on the web is still text. Okay, so we kind of owe it to our users to consider text more when we're designing our interfaces. And I think there's a few reasons that people overlook the design of the web typography. One of them is that, until recently there was only so much you could do in terms of CSS with web typography, but that's changed a lot recently and is continuing to change. We have much more flexibility with what we can actually implement using CSS. But I think another reason is that, again, it comes back to not really knowing what your content is before you end up designing the interface. So a lot of the time you'll see interface mock-ups that just have sort of placeholder text or lorem ipsum text, and it's hard to gauge when you're not actually reading that text content whether or not it's actually accessible or easily readable by the user. So part of it really comes back down to just knowing what your content is before you're designing the interface. We should really think about designing our interfaces around our content, particularly around our text content, given it's the most content that we consume, rather than the other way around, rather than designing some framework and then shoving our content in where it will fit. So I've got some examples that I will go through, and you can download the example files from this link here if you want to refer to them either now or later, which I'll demonstrate a few things. Other than that, most of the content I've got on this post is links to other articles, some of which I'll go through and draw out specific points, but a lot of it I'll leave you to read through in your own time. But I have kind of curated all these articles from a bunch of different things, and I've read them all myself, and I think they're well worth the read. So the first one starts quite simply. It's a fairly brief overview of some widely held typographic conventions. So now, when we talk about typographic conventions and conventions in general, okay, conventions usually exist for a reason. It's because they've been around for a long time. They tend to hold true in most cases. And so I think conventions, rather than seeing them as something to be constrained by, I think they're a good place. I think they're good to use as a starting point. So know what the conventions are and why they exist. And then if you want to break out of the conventions and do something different, at least you can understand the reasons why you might want to do things differently. Now, typography particularly, the history of typography has been around for a long time before computers ever existed. Okay, so a lot of the convention and theory that goes into typography is still the same conventional thinking that comes from the era of print and the printing press. So much of the terminology, as well as much of the conventions, is still held over for this. And really, a lot of it is still very much the same. Okay, typesetting a lot of it hasn't changed, regardless of whether we're doing it on the page or doing it on the screen. Okay, but there are some extra considerations that we need to add to that when we're talking about typography on the screen or on the web. And most of that has to do with the extra flexibility of a display versus paper. Okay, when you're designing typography layout for the printed page, okay, the page is going to be a certain size. Okay, there's not books that have responsive layouts. So that's the main thing that we need to add as an extra consideration to typography on our screens, and specifically for us on the web, is that we actually do have essentially a page that is able to change both its dimensions and also its use cases. Okay, so let's have a look at this article and go through some of the points. Okay, so the first point they have here is recommending that you establish a typographic hierarchy. So when we think about the reasons that we put design effort into typography, the main reason for that is to create a typographic hierarchy. And what that means is that we style different bits of text differently so that they clearly imply to the user that they're meant to have a different context or a different semantic meaning. Okay, so here's a very simple example of, like a letter type layout on the left and then the right. And even with just a little bit of differentiation in styling on the right, the hierarchy of the document, or what is meant to be considered more important, or viewed first or in a particular order, or how the document is sectioned up, okay, just by applying a little bit of differentiation in the styling actually adds a lot more to what that document communicates. So on the left, when all the text is essentially the same, really all we're limited in terms of what the styling is saying about the text to the reading order, the fact that we read it top to bottom, left to right, and maybe you could say the spacing as well indicates something about how the document's meant to be read. Okay, but really, other than that, that's the only differentiation that there is there. There's nothing else that it necessarily communicates. Now, a lot of people just, when it comes to creating different text styles, a lot of people stop after basically selecting a typeface and then maybe selecting different font sizes. Okay, but there's obviously a lot more that we can do to create differentiation in terms of styling different parts of text. Okay, so yes, you've got typeface, you've got font size, but you've also got things like letter spacing, word spacing, line spacing. You've got different weights of the fonts. You've got italicized and non-italicized fonts. Okay, but you've also got things like color. Okay, and then on top of that, you've got all different combinations of those styles used in comparison with each other. So you really do have a lot of when you consider all the different ways you can combine different styles in terms of text, you really do have a lot of different ways that you can style text to represent different meanings. Next section is just saying about don't make text too small. So a lot of this stuff just has to do with make sure your text is readable and ideally in the most efficient way that it can be. And one thing that's going to affect the readability of your text is having it too small. There was a trend a few years ago where designers seemed to just try and make their fonts as small as possible, and whether that was some design trend, I don't know, but I'm kind of glad that it's passing. I suspect myself that it came more out of a thing that the designers just kind of didn't want to, or certain designers just didn't want to deal with typography, and so they shoved it down as small as possible and tried to just have their layouts, be communicated with pictures. So thankfully that's kind of passed, and we don't really see those ridiculously small font sizes too much anymore. But I mean, the other thing you've got to consider is, again, who's going to be using your interface. So a font size that might be perfectly readable to your young eyes that have perfect 20/20 vision might not necessarily be that easily readable to an older audience if they form up part of the demographic of your user base. Choosing an appropriate font for the body text. Okay, so a lot of these rules are specifically related to the body text. And we say the body text, we mean the great majority bulk of the text content on the page, as opposed to like the headings or little asides and other stuff. So particularly the body text, I mean, if you make a decision that makes a heading not as readable, it doesn't matter so much because your headings only constitute a small amount of the text on the page. If it takes a tenth of a second longer to read a heading, that hasn't cost the user much. But if you've got 1,000 lines of text on a page and it takes them a tenth longer to read all of that, then it actually has cost the user a fair bit of time. So it becomes more important, a lot of these conventions, particularly when you're talking about body text. Okay, and choosing an appropriate font is one of those. And again, I really do think people choosing inappropriate fonts for body text is, again, probably a symptom of not knowing what the actual content is going to be. If you just have placeholder text like this, if you're not actually reading it and consuming what the content is meant to say, then you're not really aware of whether or not you know, a particular font or a particular style is you know, it's harder to judge the legibility of it. So ideally, if you can know what the content is going to be before choosing the font, I think this will make this decision easier. Now, just on this point, when it comes to body text, pretty much one of the first decisions that needs to be made, or is generally made by any designer, is whether to use a serifed or a sans serif font. Now, for a long time in screen-based typography design, the conventional thinking was that sans serif fonts were easier to read on the screen and serif fonts were easy to read printed out. Now, there's a lot of designers who still kind of hold on to that convention, probably in error, because, and you'll see, I'll show you an article that shows sort of the trends in uses of web typography, is that actually serif fonts on the display have made much more of a comeback. And if you think about why that might be, you can pretty much correlate that exactly with the increase in resolution densities of different displays. Because the original reason for that thinking, when kind of all displays were like, you know, the highest resolution display was 72 dots per inch, the little serifs on the characters are not, there's not enough resolution on the screen to display them without some sort of anti-aliasing, which kind of makes the text fuzzy and harder to read. So on a low resolution display, yes, a font that doesn't contain any serifs is going to be easier to map to the pixels and is probably going to be sharper and more readable. But, I mean, you've got a lot of displays now that have pixel resolutions, pixel densities as high or higher than print resolution. So that reasoning for that convention doesn't necessarily hold true anymore. Okay, and you'll see that there is a trend now where that's starting to reverse, and sans serif fonts are starting to be employed as body fonts a lot more on the web again. Not using too many fonts on a page. I think that's probably an oversimplistic way of stating it. I prefer to state this more as, if you're going to use, there's nothing wrong with using multiple typefaces on a page, but be aware that when you're changing a typeface, you're implying that the text with different typefaces has a different structural or semantic meaning. Okay, so if you just have a plain sentence like this, where there's not meant to be any different semantic meaning between different parts of the text, then there's no reason to go and use different fonts in there, different typefaces, because the reader may very well infer that they're meant to read something out of that you haven't intended or that doesn't exist. So by all means use different font faces, and you can extend that more broadly to say use different types of styling, but be aware how the contrast between different styling, different fonts, and the comparison of them does create differences in the perceived meaning of different bits of text or the information hierarchy. Giving the text room to breathe is really just talking about white space around the text, which is achieved with line spacing, letter spacing, and word spacing. Okay, and that's pretty easy. That's pretty easy to judge by eye. Okay, but again, it can be overlooked, particularly if people don't realize that it's stuff that you can control with CSS. Okay, so you do have quite fine control over things like line height, letter spacing, word spacing in CSS. In terms of line spacing, which in traditional typography terms is the same thing as leading. It's so called because back in the printing press, when you had all of the characters printed out in lead blocks, the typesetter would put them all out, and then to determine how much space there was between one line and the next, they'd literally put a strip of lead in there. So the height of that the space between the lines ended up being called the leading. Now, generally the convention would be in terms of line spacing that somewhere between 1 and 2 times the font size is generally a comfortable line spacing for optimum legibility. Okay, now that can vary a little bit. So as you have longer line lengths or characters per line, what we call the text measure, generally a wider line spacing suits longer lines better than a narrower line spacing. You can see this if you compare things like full-page documents to something like a narrow newspaper column. Okay, so a narrow newspaper column where the font might be smaller and the characters per line less tend to have smaller line spacing as well. Not making continuous use of all caps. Okay, so there's a couple of reasons for this. Again, typefaces were designed with upper and lowercase letters for a reason, and that is for readability. There's more variation in the characters when you use a mixture of upper and lowercase, and therefore that makes them more readable. You also can convey different things. So, for example, capitalization of words indicates something that's a proper noun, a name of a thing. Okay, you lose all of that when you use all capitals. Okay, so, and again, as you can see with this page, they do use all capitals for a heading. It doesn't matter so much when you use it for a heading because that doesn't constitute a huge amount of text. But when you've got it on a large amount of body text, okay, the little bits of time that it takes up extra for the user to comprehend that will add up to a significant amount of time. The other reason you want to avoid all capitals is particularly on the internet it can convey a tone of aggressiveness or shouting. Okay, so that's the other reason you might want to avoid all capitals, as you don't want to unintentionally convey a tone which you don't mean. Limiting paragraphs from 40 to 60 characters per line. So this is, again, what we refer to as the text measure, the number of characters per line. And you'll see different ranges of characters quoted by different people as the optimum line length. But generally what this is saying is don't have your lines too long and don't have them too short. The optimum for comprehension is somewhere in the middle. Now this is, so, and again you can see this, if you look at any novel, if you take a whole bunch of novels and you look at them and you count up the number of characters per line, you'll generally find that they pretty much fall within a very narrow range. Okay, because a novel is a lot of text meant to be read in one big go, and so its layout is designed to be as efficiently comprehensible as possible for the reader. Okay, and so that's why you'll find that novels tend to be all the same line length. And it usually tends to be something around the sort of 60 characters per line length. Now this becomes an extra issue on displays and on the web because we have responsive and fluid layouts. So we might design a layout that looks good on, let's say I'm designing on a 13-inch laptop, but then someone might view it on a 30-inch screen or an 80-inch TV, okay, or a tiny little phone screen, or anything else in between. Okay, and if I have a fluid layout, then, and I'm not changing the font size, then that line length is going to change. So if you take a website like Wikipedia, for example, if I just pick any article, okay, so they've designed it to be a certain size, okay, but even at my screen resolution here, which is 1920 by 1080, to me this line length is already getting a bit long. Okay, but there's much bigger monitors than what I'm viewing it on here, and I can simulate what it'll look like by scaling it down even further. Okay, and you can see that we end up getting really, really long lines of text. Now the issue with that is, and you know, they've done studies, and you can kind of test this yourself if you take the same text and read it at different line lengths. The issue with having too long a line length is you end up losing your place vertically on the page. So you get to the end of the very long line, you scan back, and then you have to sort of scan up and down to figure out what the last word was on the line before that you read. If your line length is shorter, okay, then that word that you saw, that you recognized previously, is fresher in your memory, and you're less likely to get lost vertically scanning the page. Okay, the opposite is also true. If you've got too narrower line lengths, then you're having to adjust your vision much more quickly. So you have to kind of doing bigger jumps between the end of the line and the start of the line on very narrow lines of text. Okay, so somewhere in the middle, something like this is sort of the most optimum layout of text to be readable. Okay, so there are some methods of dealing with this in a responsive layout, which I'll show you in a moment in one of the examples. And there is always probably going to be some variability, but I guess the goal is to keep it within some sort of reasonable range. Don't use large amounts of centered text. So again, this is something I see a lot when people do mock-ups of page layouts with dummy text that they're not reading. There's nothing to be comprehended from it. Okay, and so what they do is, rather than treating it as text, they treat it as a visual element, and then they just look at the page as a whole image and go, well, this looks more symmetrical if I center this. Okay, and then it's not until they actually put the actual text in there that anyone might realize that it takes longer to read central line text than it does to read left justified text. Okay, there's a reason that novels, newspapers, whatever, are all either left aligned or justified. Okay, and that is again because as you're going down the page, it gives you a common reference point in order for your eyes to scan. And again, this stuff might seem really, really minimal, and it probably is. The amount of time difference is going to be minimal, but when you're talking about body text, a large amount of text, those little bits of time lost on scanning each line is going to add up to a significant amount of time for the viewer. Okay, so again, doesn't mean you can't use centered text, but use it appropriately. Okay, so obviously if you're doing something like you're referencing something that's maybe a quote or song lyrics or poetry, okay, then that's something that stylistically is generally put in as center-aligned text, because you're not meant to read poetry and song lyrics really fast as possible. You're meant to kind of absorb it. Okay, so center-aligned text or something like that is fine, but just make sure it's the reason for using it is relevant. Making sure there's enough contrast between the text and background. Again, I see this a lot, particularly when people use dummy text or lorem ipsum text, because you don't realize that you can't read it until there's something to be read there, really. I mean, obviously, this is a reasonably extreme example. But, so, now interestingly, although it doesn't mention it here, you can actually have too much contrast affecting the legibility as well. Okay, so while it's not as severe as having too little contrast, if you do an experiment where you take a perfectly white background and a completely black foreground text, or the opposite, particularly with a display as opposed to a printed page which reflects light, a display which emits light, if you've got too much contrast, can actually both affect the efficiency at which someone can read something, but particularly with a light emittive device can also induce eye strain a lot more as well. So just bumping the contrast back down a little bit can actually help out quite a lot there, particularly if you've got a lot of text to communicate. And this is also something that you have to be contextually aware about. So you have to think also where your interface is going to be viewed. It might be viewed on a projector, which generally, because the projector light is a lot weaker than a display like this, okay, generally you need more contrast on a projector display. than you would on a display like this. But also, perhaps your interface might be being viewed on a mobile phone outside in the sun, in which case you probably need more contrast as well. Okay, but these are all just things you have to consider how to make your design decisions work across a range of things. Now, the other thing is that you can think about contrast not just in terms of luminosity value, not just in terms of how light or dark they are, but also you can create contrast both stylistically but also in terms of color. So you could have things that have a similar luminosity value, but you choose to contrast them by using different colors. Now, this is something you have to be careful of, particularly if you're trying to make your interface accessible, which in an ideal world we should all really be doing. Okay, so you might use a selection of colors which, for someone with color vision, has good contrast. Okay, but someone who is colorblind and can only see it in grayscale, the luminosity values of your different colors may look the same shade of gray to someone with color blindness. So the way that you can test that is you can screenshot your website, put it into Photoshop, change the color mode to grayscale, and then you can see exactly what it would look like for someone who can only detect luminosity values and not the different colors. But that's just something to kind of be aware of. And again, all of this stuff should be contextual to the use case and also the user themselves. Okay, so the next link here is a link to a site called the Elements of Typographic Style Applied to the Web. And I really like this site because it takes it sort of takes the traditional typography theory and then adds onto it stuff that's relevant to digital displays into the web. It goes over a lot of the same stuff as that previous article, but it goes into it in more detail and probably more importantly gives good justifications for each convention. Okay, so you should never really take any convention at face value. If anyone's ever telling you that you should follow a convention, they should be able to justify why that convention exists. And so I think this page, this site does a good job of that. So I'll let you read through that your own time. It's not as long as it looks, actually. Most of these sections are quite short, but I really think this is probably the best. This is the best overall web typography resource I think I've found that's freely available on the web. Let's see what else. Okay, we've got an article here from Smashing Magazine. It's a couple of years old now, but I think still relevant. Basically, they did a sort of analysis of a whole bunch of different websites to identify typographic design patterns and trends. And this one's from 2013, and they compare it to the previous one that they did in 2009. And this sort of harkens back to a point I was making earlier. One part of this talks about the prevalence of using serifed and sans serif fonts on the web. Okay, so there's a section here that talks about using serif versus sans serif fonts for body text. And the interesting point here is that they compare it with the 2009 analysis that they did, and that period, sort of 2009 to 2013, correlates very well with the rapid increase in display densities of digital devices. And you'll see that in the 2009 analysis that they did, that sans serif fonts were much more common than serif fonts, and by 2013, that statistic had completely reversed. So you can see this is the 2013 analysis, and actually almost 2/3 of websites that they analyzed used serif fonts for the body text. So the trend actually completely reversed in the space of a few years from having primarily sans serif fonts used as body text on website to using serif fonts. And I think you can look at that and point to a direct correlation with that rapid increase in display densities of different devices. Okay, so they do other things like looking at most popular typefaces, analyzing whether sites are using dark text on a light background or light text on a dark background, average font sizes for different headlines, average font size for body copy, ratios of headlines to body font size, okay, all of this sort of stuff, optimal line heights, characters per line. Okay, so interesting to see that they analysed was mainly 55 to 75, or an average of 83. Okay, so they analyse a whole bunch of stuff, and the reason that I think this is good to analyse this sort of stuff is not to constrain you to what everyone else is doing, but to give you a good starting point and see what the range of commonly implemented things are. So you at least have a baseline to know what is common, and then if you want to break away from any of these conventions, at least you then are aware that you're doing that, and so you should then be aware that you've got a good reason for breaking away from that. Okay, and I think that's fundamentally what makes a good designer, being aware of the conventions, but being able to justify your design decisions for either using them or ignoring them. Okay, so I'll look at my first example now, and it's mainly got to do with how we size text in CSS, which sounds very simple, but there's quite a bit to say about it. And mostly this will revolve around the mysterious EM unit. So I use EM units a lot in my examples, and I know a bunch of people have sort of asked me why, and I haven't specifically addressed it in any great detail, but it deserves addressing, because the EM unit is very useful, but it's something that I feel like a lot of people stay away from because they don't really understand it, or it goes against the way that they're used to working. But it really is something that is not that difficult to understand once you know what it does. And so hopefully I can demonstrate that here. I've got a few links. First of all, on the EM itself, a link to a Wikipedia article on the EM unit. And so the EM, or the M, is a unit that's been around ever since the traditional days of the printing press. So again, to go back to the printing press, there's a diagram here of what a character would look like on a printing press. They're all carved into lead or metal blocks, and the typesetter, the person who puts all the characters into the printing press, okay, that was their job, to actually place characters into the printing press. They needed to have a unit of measurement which was relative to the fonts that they were using, or the typeface that they were using. So you're probably aware that if you've got a bunch of text and you change the typeface, or you change the font that it uses, can vary dramatically how much space a font takes up, okay? Because you take the same character in a whole bunch of different fonts, and one might be really skinny and another might be really thick. Okay, so it's not consistent across different fonts. So you can't. So to use a fixed unit of measurement like millimeters or centimeters for it would not necessarily be flexible to be used as a unit relative to a particular font. So what they did was they decided that they would create a unit called the EM. And this is where the name comes from, where they would essentially take for any font the E character and the M character and put them right next to each other. Okay, and at a given font size, one EM unit was the width of the E and the M character right next to each other. Okay, and so that size would vary depending on what the font is, but it would always stay consistent relative to the font itself. And so that's that's the same way that we use it in CSS. And that's kind of a complicated explanation, but what it comes down to is that whereas something like pixels, if we size a font using pixels, that's an absolute size or an absolute measurement for something, whereas EMs are a relative measurement. There's a link here to the W3C article about them, which probably goes into way more detail than anyone cares about, but I put it in there anyway. And I've got a couple of other articles on understanding EM units as well, which I'll let you read through in your own time. This list of part 1, how to size text in CSS, is I think particularly good because it goes through the same example of sizing things using absolute and relative units and shows you the various different outcomes of them. But I'm going to attempt to give my own explanation using an example as well, which I will show now. Okay, so I've got the example files downloaded here. So these files are all complete. I'm not really going to add anything to them. I'm just going to show you and turn things on and off in the developer tools to show you what the differences are when we do things in relative and absolute units. Okay, so I've got what's kind of the most basic explanation I can think of for an EM unit. So if we understand that there's absolute units and relative units, okay, so pixels are an absolute unit. 10 pixels is always 10 pixels. Okay, a relative unit would be something like a percent. Okay, so we're used to sizing things like divs in percentages. If we want a div to take up 50% of the available width of its parent container or of the page, okay, we can set its width to be 50%. Okay, and then that adjusts as we make the page or the container bigger or smaller. So it's not a fixed value. So EM units are relative units in the same way that percentage is, but whereas percentage is determined based on the size relative to the parent container or relative to the width of the window, okay, the size of an EM unit is determined relative to the current font size. Okay, and sizing things based on the current font size can actually be really, really useful, particularly if we start sort of flipping our way of thinking of designing interfaces. Is what is the content and how do we design the interface around this content so that the content is most easily digestible by the user, rather than going, let's design a skeleton and then we'll get the content later and we'll just shove it in wherever it fits. Okay, so and that's how we should be thinking. We should be thinking about a content-centric way of designing stuff. So one simple example of where EM units can come in handy is by using them to size fonts themselves. Okay, so I've got a div here. Okay, I've got a div here, and let me just bring up my styles section. Okay, inside this div, I've got a heading 3 there. Okay, and the heading 3 I have sized in EM units. It's 1.5 EMs, and I'll explain how that ends up being a certain size in a bit. Okay, and I've got the paragraph here, which is specifically styled in absolute pixel units. Okay, so the paragraph there is 16 pixels, the heading 3 there is 1.5 EMs. Now let's just say I style this up with the paragraph in pixel units, and then I decide that I want to change the font size of everything in there. Okay, if I've got this in, well, let's just do an experiment. Okay, so I've got the same div here. All right, and what I've done is I've left all the styles of the stuff inside there the same, but I've applied a class to this div of font 200%, which if I scroll down here a bit, I can see applies this style of font size 200%. So what that's saying is everything inside of that container double the size of the font size. Now you'll see what's happened here is the heading itself has doubled in font size. Okay, it's twice the size of what it was there, but the paragraph is maintaining the same 16 pixel font size as it already was. Okay, now to adjust this, it wouldn't take me too much time. I could just go in here and change that 16 to 32 pixels. Okay, but imagine that you had done this with an entire document or even an entire website. You designed everything out in pixels and then you decided that the font size was too small for your target audience and you need to bump everything up by 1.5 times. You'd have to go through every single instance in your CSS where you've defined a font size in pixels, recalculate the new value, and then put that in pixels every time you wanted to make the change. Whereas if you define your font sizes in EM units, all you'd have to do is put a multiplier for the font size on the root element of the unit, and everything in the whole page, or the whole container of what you apply it to, would scale up or down nicely with that. Okay, so this is the same example here again where where I've applied the 200% style again to the font, but now the paragraph, rather than being in pixels, is defined in EM units as well. Okay, so I haven't got it specifically here, but it will be taking it from the default font size of the document. Now, what actually can be a worse symptom of using pixel sizes is only really evident when you start to look at the same interface on different devices. And this is probably the main reason that EM units were added to CSS. If we sort of go back for a moment and think about a layout that we design on a desktop computer, and we design all the fonts to be a particular size, and we like our information hierarchy, our heading sizes, our paragraph sizes, and all that. We go and design those in pixel values. Okay, and so in pixel values on my desktop display, they take up a certain amount of space. But then if I go and open up that same interface on my phone, and it takes up the same number of pixels, but my phone I'm not looking at the same distance from my computer. My phone I'm looking at a lot closer. So 16 pixels on my phone is going to be too big. Okay, and then the flip side is true. If I take that same interface, and rather than looking at it on my computer, I look at it on a 60-inch television, which is 3 meters across, 3 meters at the back of the room from where I'm sitting at. Okay, then suddenly 16 pixels is probably going to be way too small for me to comfortably read. So the idea of an EM unit and why it works so well with responsive design is that something that looks the correct size in a certain number of EM units on one device is designed to look the correct size on all devices. Okay, it should be intelligently scaled on all devices to essentially take up the same amount of your field of vision on all of those devices, depending on how big they are and how close they are to you. Okay, so if we look again at this page here, if I go and open up this example in, I can't do it on my phone because I can't show you my phone, but I've got the iOS simulator installed here. Okay, so I can open it up on an iPhone emulator. Okay, if I open this up, notice that everything on this page except that paragraph is sized with EM units. Okay, so notice how everything, even though they're fundamentally the same size, everything gets sized down a little bit on the phone. Okay, and it would actually be more exaggerated than this because that phone's blown up there. Okay, but notice that all this stuff is smaller than the same EM units appear here. Okay, except for this paragraph here, which specifically is sized in pixel values, appears the same size here. Okay, so to me, everything here is still nicely sized. I could still, if I looked at this on my phone, I could still read this nicely. I can still read this nicely and still read this nicely. But look what happens here. My paragraph all of a sudden is appearing bigger than my heading 3. It completely destroys my information hierarchy. Okay, so that's really the biggest reason to use EM units, is to make sure that if you've designed the text sizes of everything to look right on one display, that it's going to look right across all displays. Okay, so now this next session addresses hopefully the main reason why people don't use EM units, is because when you're designing a font size, especially if you use something like Photoshop to design, you're going to design it in pixels or in points. Okay, and so then thinking in EM units is hard to figure out. I don't know how much of the screen one EM unit's going to take up. So there's an easy way that you can do the conversion, and what you have to do first of all is know what the default font size of the browser is. Now, if you don't specify a default font size on your HTML element, then the browser's default font size is generally always going to be 16 points or 16 pixels. Okay, in my examples, I've overridden the font size to be the same amount, but just to make sure that there's no confusion amongst any browser that might have a different default font size, I specifically told my HTML element to use a default font size of 16 pixels. What this means now is that one EM unit is going to equate on my desktop here to 16 pixels. Okay, so that means if I want my, and generally this is the method that and I'd say most people do, is the thing that you want to kind of base your font size variations off is probably your paragraph font size. Most of the text on your page is going to be in paragraph elements. So if I can decide what font size I want my paragraph to be, in which case I said I want it to be 16 pixels, then I make my paragraph 1 EM unit, so 1 EM unit, and then to figure out the conversion between pixels and EM units, as long as you can do simple multiplication and division, it's quite easy to figure out. Okay, so the size in pixels is going to be your default font size times the EM units. Okay, so simplest case, my paragraph at 1 EM is going to be 1 times the default font size of 16 pixels. It's equals 16 pixels. Okay, so now let's just say I wanted to make my heading 2 24 pixels. I know that my default font size is 16 pixels. I wanted to make my heading, let's say I want to make my heading 2, or we'll take my heading 3. We'll make my heading 3 24 pixels. Okay, in order to do that, I just do the reverse. I do division. So if I've got 24 pixels, okay, I divide it by my default font size, which is 16 pixels. Okay, and so the EM units that equates to that is 1.5 EM units. Okay, and that's exactly what I've done down here with my heading 3. Okay, except that's a typo. That's meant to say 1.5 times 16. I copied and pasted it and forgot to change it. Okay, so my heading 3 at 1.5 EMs is 1.5 times 16, 24 pixels. My heading 2 is 2.4 EMs, 2.4 times 16, 36.4. And my heading 1, likewise 3.6 EMs, is 3.6 times the default font size of 16 pixels. Now actually, once you've been doing this for a while, you can actually get out of even thinking about pixels entirely. The only pixel decision you really need to make is your default font size. And if you just choose your paragraph to be a default font size, for example 16 pixels, then really when you think about what you're doing with your headings, the pixel values don't really matter so much. When you think about what a heading's meant to do, is it's meant to draw more attention to itself than the thing below it. Okay, so a heading 1's meant to be more attentive than heading 2, which is meant to be more obvious than a heading 3, which is meant to be more obvious than a paragraph. So what I tend to do is use the default 1 EM for my paragraph and then go, okay, I want my heading 3 to be 1.5 times as big as my paragraph, and then my heading 2 I made 2.4 times as big as my paragraph, and then my heading 1 I made 3.6 times as big as my paragraph. And I don't really care what pixel values they turn out to be, which is why I end up with these weird decimal pixel values. But to me, the more important thing is it's kind of like the heading 3 is should be 1.5 times as visible as the heading, and then go up from there. And if you look at some of those other articles that I've posted, when it talks about actually deciding what the ratio should be for all of your headings, it talks about doing that in terms of ratio rather than pixels anyway. So and whether the ratio you apply is like the golden ratio or an exponential ratio or whatever it is that you apply, that really should be the way that you're thinking about your different levels of font sizes anyway. Now, one thing that you do need to be careful of when you're using EM units is understanding that they can actually compound. Now, when I say that EM units, when I say that these EM units work out as, so 1.5 for EMs is 1.5 times the default font size, or my HTML font size here. It's not 100% true in every case. What it means is that it'll be 1.5 times whatever the current font size is. So if you nest font sizes inside of nested elements, they're going to compound the font sizes. Now the best way I can think of explaining this is with this example here. So I've got this unordered list here, and inside it I've got a list item which itself contains another list, which itself contains another list. So I've got like a 3-level nested list here with different list items. Now, what I might think to do is say, well, okay, I want all of my list items to be 1.5 times as big as my paragraph. So I could create a style to make my list items 1.5 EMs. Actually, this is a typo too. It's not a class, it's an element, so that dot shouldn't be there. Okay, but I could say, okay, I want to make, for my list items, make the font size 1.5 EMs, expecting them all then to be 1.5 times my default 16 pixels and all be 24 pixels big. Okay, but if I do that, I end up getting something like this. Okay, and the reason this happens is because if we look at the first one, okay, my first list item goes, okay, make me 1.5 EMs, make me 1.5 times the current font size. Now, there's no, between that top list item and the root HTML element, there's no other overrides of the font size, so it uses the 16 pixels as its current font size. Okay, so this first one here gets 1.5 times 16 pixels equals 24 pixels. But then we get down to the next level here, okay, and this is also set to be 1.5 EMs, but because it's nested inside of this first list item, okay, we actually get a compounding effect. So what I get is this one is 1.5 times as big as the default font size, and then this is 1.5 times as big as that one. So it ends up going 1.5 times by 1.5 times each time we go down a nesting level. So by the time we get to level 3, it's gone 1.5 times by 1.5 times by 1.5 times 16 pixels. Okay, and this is actually the way that the EM units is designed to work. It's meant to work that way because it allows us to do things like when we have this thing here and we just say, well, we want to make this whole container be relatively bigger than everything else. It allows us to do that. Okay, but it's obviously not the desired effect that we want each time. In this case, I really did just want all 3 of these to be 1.5 times the root default font size of 16 pixels. Okay, so there's a very easy way around that, and there's another unit in CSS which is exactly the same as the EM unit in every way, except that it doesn't do this compounding thing. It takes as its base font size whatever the root units, the root being the very top HTML element, which is the HTML tag itself, whatever its font size is. Okay, and that unit is called the REM, which is short for root EM unit. So if I take this same example here, and I change this style from font size 1.5 EMs to 1.5 REMs, okay, then these all become 1.5 times the root HTML elements font size. Okay, so REM units exactly the same as EM units, except they don't do the compounding thing. Okay, so far I've just used EM units to size text itself. Now the thing that usually confuses people with my examples is, in terms of this, is I like to use EM units a lot to size things that aren't text. And I'll show you why I do that. So I've got another example here called textmeasure.html. Okay, so here's two divs again with these borders around them. The contents are identical. The only difference is this first one. Okay, this first one has the width of that containing div set in pixels, set to 576 pixels, and the padding is also set in pixels. Okay, so the space between the border and the text is set in pixels. The next one down here is exactly the same in every other way, except that it has the width and the padding both set in EM units. Okay, so I'm setting things that aren't text in units that are relative to the font size. And the reason that I'm doing this is, so this harkens back to the point I was making before about how we maintain a consistent text measure or characters per line in a responsive layout. So what you can see here is, let's see what happens if I take the, let's go to the HTML document, and again I've got my default font size as 16 pixels, and let's say I bump that down to 10 pixels. Okay, so what you can see as the font size has gotten smaller here, because this container is still a fixed number of pixels wide, now the font size being smaller, more characters fit on each line. Okay, so the text measure or the line length has gotten longer. Whereas this second one here, the line length has stayed exactly the same, but the container itself has actually sized down to be narrower. Okay, so the thing that's remaining consistent now is my text measure. Okay, and this, it's not, I mean, that's not a really badly long line length, but of course this could vary a lot more. Okay, it works the same way if I increase the font size. Let's say I increase the font size to 24 pixels. Okay, now my first div here, okay, has a really narrow, I'm only fitting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about six words per line. Whereas I go back down to my second one here, and it's still maintaining that nice line length. Okay, incidentally, the reason that I've chosen The reason that I've chosen 36 EM units, okay, is because if we remember that one EM unit is basically the width of 2 characters, then if I want 72 characters per line, then the EM length of that is half of that. Okay, so 36 times 2 characters is 72 characters per line. Okay, and this way, by sizing the container in units relative to the font, it allows me to maintain the same text measure. The other thing you'll notice is that the padding also is in EM units in this second example. Now in this top example, you can see that the padding has remained in pixels, and while the font size has gotten bigger, the padding now looks too narrow for that size of text. Okay, so padding really around text is something that should be relative to the text size itself. Now this in EM units, when I size up the font, the padding increases. Okay. Now some people actually I should explain one more thing. You might think it would be difficult to figure out how to get the EM width exactly the same as the pixel width, but really it just comes back down to knowing that simple equation that you have to do. So deciding that this one was going to be 576 pixels, to determine the number of EM units across, okay, I'm simply going to divide 576 by the current font size, which is 16 pixels, which ends up giving me 36 EM units. Okay, right there. Now, doing this sort of thing can freak some people out because they still can't really get over not having absolute control over the containers of all their stuff. So, I mean, the first thing I'd say to that is you really do have to stop thinking about fitting your content in a thing, in a framework or a skeleton, but having your content and then designing the skeleton around that so that it fits the content. But having said that, you can still have control over you still can have direct control over the size or the width of your container whilst maintaining a constant text measure by dynamically adjusting the font size. So in this case here, I've got a container, okay, which is a certain size, and I've got it set to automatically adjust with the width. But what this does now, rather than making the container bigger or smaller, I control the width of the container, and it actually adjusts the font size so that the text measure still maintains consistency. So what this ends up doing is it ends up sizing text more like an auto-sized image would act. Okay, and maybe in some cases that's more suitable than actually adjusting the container to the font size. The only downside with this is there's no real reliable way to do it in CSS. You could try using viewport width units, but that might mess you up if you have different stacking columns or your containers don't take up a consistent portion of the viewport. So the best way of doing this at the moment is by using a JavaScript plugin, and the one that I've used for this is called flowtype.js, which you can find just by Googling it. It'll be the first thing that comes up. Okay, and it's designed exactly to do this. You have a specific width container, okay, and as that container adjusts, rather than changing the line length, it sizes the font up and down. And it's quite easy to implement. You simply download the file. And so here's my HTML document. It doesn't require jQuery itself, but I've included jQuery anyway, so I can use the document.ready function. But we simply just include the JavaScript file, okay, which I've got in my JS folder here, flowtype.js, and then I've got a document.ready function so that this doesn't execute until the page is loaded. And then all you do is select the thing that you want to have this behavior. In the case of my example, it was just that one div there, but you could select the body element and it would apply to the whole text on the whole page. And then you call the flowtype function, and you don't have to pass it any parameters, and then it just automatically works. It will do the dynamic text sizing for you. And you can see if we inspect this element up here that what it's doing is it's putting a style attribute on the container that you've selected and adjusting the font size. And you can see that as it highlights in purple how it's adjusting the font size essentially to fit the container. Now, one thing you might notice about this example is even though thus far all my examples, and I've generally told you that the best place to put your JavaScript is before the closing body tag, this is one of the cases where you kind of need to put it before the content that's rendered. And the reason for that is if the page loads the HTML before the JavaScript, it's going to show the unmodified text for a second. It's going to flash that, and then it's going to show the text that's modified by flowtype. So it will look like a little visual glitch, which isn't a huge thing, but generally it's not something that you want. So if you put the script first, yes, it will make sure it downloads the JavaScript first. It will delay the rendering of the page by a little bit, but you won't get that visual glitch. Okay. So that hopefully convinces you a little bit of the benefit of using EM units to size things so that they're relative to text. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is just some of the options that we have for styling text in modern CSS. Okay, so you know, back in the day, before CSS, back in the day, pretty much, your only options in terms of styling text were you were limited in the font faces that you could use. Okay, there was no such thing as custom web fonts. So you could only choose a font that you were sure was on everyone's system, which was really just a handful of fonts. You could change the font size, you could change colors, you could do line height, and some other very simple styling things. And that was kind of all you could do with the text. If you wanted any more elaborate styling on text than that, generally you had to do it in Photoshop, save it as an image, and then include that image in the page. Now, while that looks fine, there are several issues with that. Firstly, an image is always going to take up more space in terms of download than text is. So you're increasing the download time of the page. Okay, but probably more importantly, an image doesn't behave like text. You can't select the text in an image. You can't search the page for it. And probably most importantly of all, a search engine can't index text that's in an image. Okay, so what was quite common to do was you'd have your paragraphs as normal text, and then maybe you did fancy headings which you put in as an image. Okay, which might have looked nice, but a search engine wouldn't know what the text was in those headings, and so it would penalize you in terms of the search rankings, because it couldn't tell what the text was that it should be indexing for those headings. Okay, which a search engine generally uses for determining what the structure of your page is. So fortunately, a lot of flexibility has been added to CSS to allow us to style text in a lot of different ways. And so more and more there's things that we can do with text to style it in more elaborate ways so that we don't need to include images. And so really the rule should be, if you can do it in CSS with text, do it in CSS. Only investigate including text as an image as a very last resort. And even then, think about, is the value of having that fancy styling on the text going to outweigh the disadvantage of, not having selectable text and not having search engine indexable text? Okay, but anyway, this is the example here. So I'm going to show you a selection of different things. I'm sure a lot of them some people are aware of, but some people might not be. But it's not an exhaustive list either. Okay, so this is an example here. Okay, but these are some of the common things that people would usually create in Photoshop and put in as an image rather than doing as CSS. So I'll start off very simply. First of all, I just want to say a few things about line height. So line height is another thing that you don't want to use absolute units for. So if we take this paragraph here, okay, and let's just say I set the font size to be 16 pixels and the line height I'll also set to be 16 pixels. Okay, so to me that's too condensed. I'm going to bump this up a little bit. Let's make the line height, say, 22 pixels. That looks okay. Now again, because line height is a style that's related to text, okay, if you use absolute units to size the line height, you're going to run into this similar problems with other things in terms of sizing text absolute size. Even if my font size itself is set in EM units, so if I change this to 1 EM, okay, if I then go and decide to make the text bigger or smaller, so let's make this text bigger, I'll make it 2 EMs, because my line height is still set in the absolute value of pixels, okay, it's not going to scale nicely with the font size. So what I could do is do the line height in EM units, okay, but actually what's better than that, because you might think that the EM units here refers to that font size, but actually refers to the parent. The actual best way to do line height is to use no units at all. So I'm just going to put the value 1 there. And what that means is that your line height is simply going to be a ratio of your font size. And I actually think this is a good way of thinking it, because if you want single spacing, the line height is 1. If you want double spacing, okay, you use a line height value of 2. If you want 1.5 times spacing, 1.5. Okay, which is really kind of the way you should be thinking of line spacing anyway. And now when I adjust the font size, okay, no matter what I set this to, okay, the line spacing remains consistent. Okay, letter spacing. Letter spacing is something that's rarely used actually, but can be quite useful, particularly if you're trying to fit some text. Let's say you've got a heading and you're trying to fit that heading into a certain horizontal space, but you don't want to change the font size. You can play around with the letter spacing and adjust how much horizontal space that it takes up by quite a lot. So the CSS for letter spacing is exactly that, letter dash spacing. And again, this is something that you want to use EM units for, because you want the spacing to be relative again to the font size. If I change this font size up or down, okay, then if I use EM units for the spacing, it's going to remain relative to the font size, which is generally what you want, rather than using fixed pixels. So we can use positive and negative values for letter spacing. So this first example has 1 EM of letter spacing, so it puts one times the current font size in EMs between each letter. This one here actually has negative font spacing. So if I turn that off, you can see that's the default spacing, letter spacing for that font. And I can actually make it more condensed by using a negative value for letter spacing. All right, and I can keep going smaller and smaller, but you'll see that they end up overlapping each other. Okay, but different fonts tend to have different default letter spacings anyway, so you might find a font that you like but decide that it's not condensed enough or too condensed, and you can use letter spacing to adjust that. And you could apply that even to individual letters by putting a space around them. If you just didn't like the kerning between two different characters, you could also do that as well. There's also word spacing, which is just like letter spacing, except the spaces are between words rather than letters. And there's not much more to say about that, other than the syntax for it is what you would expect, word dash spacing. And again, you should use EM units if you want it to stay relative to the font size. Okay, so that's extra word spacing, and that's decreased word spacing. Okay, so let's move on to something a little bit less bland. So drop capitals are something that people have been doing for a while, but the only way they've really been able to do it is by taking out a letter of the text and putting it in as an image. So this is something that you can actually achieve using pure CSS now. And so you can see if I select this element, there's my paragraph there, and you'll notice there's no image inside that paragraph. Okay, it's purely just text. Okay, now the advantages of using text here are aside from all the general ones that I said, this is actually a more efficient way of developing as well. You can imagine if you had written let's say you've written a whole novel as a website. Okay, maybe each chapter starts with a drop capital. You might have a whole bunch of chapters. And so you could go through, do the text, and then figure out which letters are all the drop capitals and create an image for each of them and then put them in and then style it. But let's say then you do an edit later on to the text and you decide that the first sentence of the chapter is going to be changed. Then all of a sudden the letter changes, you have to go and make a new image and update it. Okay, and it's all a big hassle. In this way, it doesn't matter. We just do the style once, and it doesn't matter if I change this letter here. Okay, it's because it's all just text, it's just going to update nicely. It doesn't matter at all. Okay, and because I've got this applied as a class, and I've defined this as this style as a class, which I'll break down for you in a moment, it means that I can take any paragraph here, and apply the class to it as well. So I'll add this class to this next paragraph here of drop-cap. Okay, and you'll notice I can then go and style any paragraph with a drop capital without modifying any of the content in any way other than adding a class to that element. Okay, so how did I actually achieve this drop capital? Let's put it back to a nice looking letter. There we go. And let's get rid of, so let's just refresh the page, I think. Okay, so there's my paragraph, and you'll notice it's got a class of drop cap. So I'm looking down on my styles here now, and this is the appropriate CSS style that basically does everything. So I've got paragraph with a class of drop cap, okay, and then I've got an extra bit on here which is a pseudo selector first letter. So what this does is say apply this style that I'm defining here to the paragraph with the class of drop cap, but only apply it to its first letter. Okay, and so that's how it's just selecting that first letter for the drop capital. Okay, and then I'll disable all these styles and re-enable them one by one so you can see what each does. Okay, but again, you can see if I disable them, it's just plain text here. Okay, selectable, searchable, search engine indexable text. Okay, so the first thing I did was increase the font size a bunch. Okay, and you'll notice that sort of pushed the alignment of the other text out because my line height is relative to my font size. The line height here is going based off this giant M here, so it's pushing everything down. Now the next thing I did is I basically want everything else to wrap around it. So what I've done is I've made the first letter float left, okay, and then everything else flows around it. But you'll notice there's still space on the top and the bottom. So to deal with that, I've just adjusted the line height and the margin so that it sits nicely aligned with those things. I've applied a different custom font, which is a web font that I downloaded, which I'll go into more detail in a moment. I've applied a different font there. And then the only other thing I've done is, because you can see the other text here is kind of butting up real close to that first letter there, I've just applied a margin right to that first letter as well. Okay, and I can do any other kind of styling I wish to on the text. I can change its color if I want. Anything I can do with regular text, I can do with that. Okay, and so that's a completely CSS-based drop capital. So it's not really a thing you need to use images for anymore. As long as you can find a font with the design that you want, that will work. Okay, next section is columns. So columns is kind of something that we've sort of been able to do for a while. We can create divs and float them left and right and put content in either one. The only problem with that is because they're two separate elements, we have to decide what text goes in column 1 and what text goes into column 2. So it would be much nicer if we had a way of essentially just taking an element and saying, however big this element is, just make everything flow in a certain number of columns. So this has also been added to CSS, and browser support's generally pretty good, but you may have to use, for some of these things, you may have to use what's called vendor prefixes. But if you look up any of these CSS styles, it will tell you all the vendor prefixes that you have to use. But essentially, let's see, let's find the actual thing here. Okay, so here's my columns class that I put on the containing div that has this stuff in it. And you'll notice that it's using the vendor prefix. So the actual CSS style is column count here. That determines the number of columns. Okay, and the vendor prefix is this bit that comes before it. And in different browsers, you might have to use different ones. In Chrome and Safari, it uses the WebKit vendor prefix. In Mozilla, it uses -moz. In Opera, it uses -o. And I think that's it for vendor prefixes. I'm not sure if IE has its own one, but I don't think it does. Okay, but anyway, the base CSS style is column count. So the number you put in there determines the number of columns everything will flow in. Okay, so I can make that as many or as few as I like. And then you've got column gap, which allows you to change the amount of space between the columns here. Make that bigger or smaller. And then there are other styles as well. If you just do a search for the CSS columns, you'll find those. There's things like you can specify a style called column rule, which allows you to basically draw a line like a border down in between the columns, all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, but that allows you to lay things out in columns. Rotating text. Okay, so this is another example where until CSS transforms, I would have had to do this as an image. But this is probably another good example whereby not having to do it as an image saves a lot of time and hassle. So this is obviously a date, but let's just say I wanted to use this date to use as like a badge on a blog post for the post date for it. I'd need to create one of these for every single day of the year, for every year that I was going to make a blog post. So that's a whole lot of images, and then if I wanted to go and change the design, I'd have to go and change it on every single one. So doing this in text allows me to style everything with CSS, makes it dynamic, makes it a lot easier to deal with. And the only trick to this really is that, so if you remember back to last week when we did the parallax scrolling example, I talked about CSS transforms, which I used to offset the things by different amounts. And so so I talked about transforms that you have were translate, scale, and rotate, okay, among others. So in this case, the text elements are HTML elements, we can use those transforms on them just like we would that cloud picture or any other element that we have. So what I've done is I've used a rotate transform on this bit of text that has the year in it in order to rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise so that it stands up straight like this. So the overall structure of this part here is I've got a div that contains everything, and then I've got 3 spans, one for the day, one for the month, and one for the year. Okay, and and I've sized them roughly how I want them to be. In order to position them, I've set the position style of the containing div to be relative, and then the 3 spans are set to position absolute, and then I position them from the top and from the left, okay, using top and left values. Then the only extra thing with the 2015 one is that I've rotated it as well. Okay, so I've applied this style transform rotate minus 90 degrees, which means rotate minus 90 degrees around that way, or 90 degrees anti-clockwise. Okay, the only thing you have to note is that it has to be display block or inline block in order to be able to be rotated for some reason. I don't know, but just has to. Now the only thing that gets a little bit tricky here is when it transforms does top still refer to top, or is it now left and is left, or is it now bottom? Okay, but essentially I just played around with the values and nudged them until it sat in the right place. And I adjusted the letter spacing a little bit so that it kind of aligned nicely with the top and the bottom of this. Now the other thing to point out with this example is all of my measurements, again, I've done in EM units. And again, that's just because I can now size this whole thing based off the font size. So when I actually originally designed this, it was actually that big. And then I decided that's probably too small to show on a projector. I need it to be bigger. If I had have done all of the offsets and the positioning in pixels, I would have had to go and redo them. But because I did them in EMs, I can just make this whole div, have a font size of 300%, and it makes it 3 times bigger. Okay, which just makes it more useful and reusable. If I want to reuse this in different contexts across the site, for example, if I want it small somewhere and bigger somewhere else, I can reuse the same thing and just make a font size adjustment in the instance that I want it to be different. Text shadows. Text shadows is probably the most common thing that people used to do, create it in Photoshop and use images for, to create a drop shadow style thing. And there we go, it's got back there. Okay, but it's something that CSS now allows natively. So again, I've got here a text element, it's the paragraph, and it's pretty simple and pretty well cross-browser supported. The syntax is we use text-shadow, and then we give it 3 different numbers and a color value. So the color value is obviously the color of the shadow, which you usually make black, but it can be any color that you want. And I've specified it in an RGBA, or red, green, blue alpha value, so that I can set the opacity lower. So at the moment I've got it set to be black with 40% opacity. Now the first 3 values, or the first 2 values, represent the horizontal and the vertical offset. So if I specify them, if I don't specify them or specify them as 0, okay, the shadow appears directly aligned with it, and it looks more like kind of an outer glow. Okay, but generally when you have a text shadow, you have an offset. So I've offset the text shadow by, just reload that. Okay, I've offset the text shadow by 0.1 EMs from the left and 0.1 EMs from the top. You can also use negative values to make the shadow go above and to the left of the text. And then the third value here is determines how much blur the shadow has. So if you have a value of 0 here, you'll get a perfectly hard shadow with no blurring. And then the bigger the value you put here, the more blurring it will have. Okay, so I'm going to up the opacity of that so you can see it better. Okay, so that there adjusts the blurring value. Okay, now you can actually achieve some pretty complex text effects by applying more than one text shadow style to an element. So you can actually effectively apply as many text shadow styles as you want, and all you have to do is separate the styles with a comma. So I can just duplicate this style with a comma there, and then put another set of values for the offset, the blur, and the color. So in this case, let's put a negative offset and let's put no blur at all, and let's make the shadow color red. And that was about good. Okay, so we can get something like that. So if you do a search around for different CSS text effects, you'll see all sorts of really complex text effects that people have achieved, including pretty much all the text styles like bevel and boss, inset that you can do in Photoshop. People have managed to achieve with CSS just by combining a bunch of text shadows together. Okay, so you can get, for example, if you just have a look at some of them. Okay, so here's an example of a bunch of different text effects, and these are all created just with CSS text shadows by combining multiple ones. So you can get kind of these cool 3D effects. Okay, you can even get things that look like they're kind of extruded in 3D, and this will just be done by putting a whole bunch of shadows on, offsetting them by a little bit more each time, but keeping them the same color. Okay, so you'll find heaps of examples where you can just copy and paste the CSS styles to get really quite complex text effects that you don't need to include as an image. The other thing to know about these is that all of this stuff can be animated just like any other CSS property, and can be applied on like hover states and stuff like that. So if I just go in and modify my CSS file. Let's just say I don't want the text shadow to be on by default, but I want it to be on a hover state. Then I can take it out of that style there and have a style like this with hover, and then have the text shadow only apply on hover. Okay, so then I can have it look like this, and when I hover over it will apply like that as well. Okay, so you can combine all this stuff into different interaction states as well. Text stroke is sort of like text shadow, but you don't have a blur. It's just like the stroke style in Photoshop, which essentially just means draw an outline. So the only two values that the text stroke takes are inspect this, okay, are a size for the stroke and then a color. Okay, now one thing to note is that the text stroke at the moment is WebKit browsers only, and so you need to use the dash WebKit dash vendor prefix. It means that if you do that style in another browser, it probably won't show up. But the other browsers should get this stuff as more stuff is standardized and added to CSS3. Text clip. Okay, so this is, while this looks like a text effect, it's mainly to do with applying a background image and combining that with text in a certain way. So what I've got here, what I might do is move that, and that, and that. Okay, let's just make... Okay, so what I've got here is just large text, all caps, okay, and I've made it a certain color. So what I can do to get textured text is, for that paragraph itself, I can apply a background image. Okay, now in this case, it's just that little tile image there, which will just get applied as a repeating pattern, but you could use one big image if you want. Okay, and then what I do is I apply this style called WebKit background clip. Again, this is WebKit only style for now, but will be available in other browsers at some point. Okay, but we set the background clip property and we set the value to text. Okay, and what that does is it only shows the background image where the text is. Now I can't see it yet because the text color is still showing over the top of it. But if I also make the color, set the color to transparent, okay, now what you can see is that the text is invisible, but the background is showing through where the text would be. Okay, and in that way we can get this textured style text like that as well. Okay, and again, it's still normal text, still selectable, still has everything good about text. But I can now do this without having to do the whole thing in Photoshop and put the whole thing in as an image. Okay, so that's just a sample of some of the things you can do, and you can combine multiple of these effects to get, you know, even more complex styles. Is there a question? No? Okay. So there's more stuff being added all the time, so you know, just kind of be on the lookout for stuff. But this is the kind of stuff, just to relate it back to your assignment, if you've got lots of text visual elements in your layout and you were thinking of including them as images, if you can find a way to do them as normal text and style them with CSS text, that would be a good way to sort of boost your technical proficiency criteria. Okay, and it's something you should try and aim to do as well. Try and always aim to implement things in their most flexible way, most efficient way, and that's going to be text with CSS styling is always going to be more efficient than creating it as an image. You should really only end up doing text as image if it's your last resort, if there's no CSS solution that will do the same thing. Okay, so that's the last kind of example I had. There's a couple more articles here. There's another Smashing Magazine article, which is kind of just about a text workflow. So kind of, if you've got a blank canvas in front of you and you're trying to decide how to, how to style all your different bits of text differently, this is a good read to go through this to suggest some recommended ways of going about things. And there's this one more little bit here about creating an information hierarchy with typography, which we talked about right at the beginning, but I just wanted to show the New York Times website as an example. It's a good example because it's very text heavy. Most of the content on here is communicated with text. And I think it's a good example to show where text differentiation within a small section, but also then keeping that consistent across different sections, really helps create an effective information hierarchy. So what I mean by that is if we take an individual little section of this, say like this little article brief here, then we can see even in this small space there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different treatments for text here. And each different one represents a different sort of bit of content. So you've got the title, the author, which uses all caps and lowercase. It's got the published date, and then it's got the little blurb about the article, and then a link to something here. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different styles, but they very specifically represent different things, okay? And there's a good information hierarchy because we can sort of see what we're meant to look at. It allows you, looking at, taking a high view, to zoom in on what the different sections are and what most important bits are, and then when you get in, sort of zoom in and you select one, it then directs you down to what you meant to read within that. So it differentiates that stuff within this, but also because those styles remain consistent. Let me zoom out here. Okay, because those styles remain consistent across the site, it's very easy to see where everything's sectioned up. It's very easy to see where the division is between that article and then another article and then another one, all the way along. Okay, so you can imagine how much more difficult that would be to get both a general overview and a more specific view of each little section if everything was the exact same font size, font weight, font color, and everything. Okay, so I just wanted to show this as what I think is quite a good example of a primarily text-based site that does quite a lot to create a good information hierarchy with its treatment of typography. Okay, a couple of other articles here which I'll let you go through. The last thing I really want to demonstrate, mainly because I had a specific request for this, is how you go about dealing with custom web fonts. So in one way it's pretty simple, but in another way it's kind of tricky. The CSS to do this is quite simple. When they added custom web fonts to CSS, really the only syntax they added was this @fontface CSS rule. So this is just the W3 schools page on it. Okay, and really all it is it looks like this. In your CSS you write this @ symbol and then font face, and then inside this style essentially you tell it what should the user refer to that font name as when they're applying it to a certain element. Okay, so just like Arial or Times New Roman or Georgia or whatever, this font has that name when I use it in CSS in the font family style, and then you point it to a particular font file, okay, using this source attribute. So that all seems pretty simple. The part that's complicated is, and a little annoying, is the fact that the different browsers haven't really agreed on a standardized font format for custom web fonts. So if you look down here in this table, these are all the different proposed font formats for web fonts, and the table shows which browsers and which versions support the different font formats. And unfortunately, there's if you want to support browsers that go back a reasonable way, there's not really one file format that covers all the bases. So what you end up having to do is including a whole bunch of different font files and referencing all of them in this font face, and then the browser will choose the one that it recognizes. So that's kind of the annoying part, is getting all the font files. So you could, if you had a font file, get it and use some program to export it, and then writing the CSS is not that difficult, but you do have to point to each font file directly. But there's ways of getting around that hassle and not having to deal with it. So the first way is to use something like Google Fonts, which is an online service which hosts the font files and the CSS font files for you. So Google Fonts is one. There's other ones around. Adobe has one called Adobe Typekit, although I'm pretty sure that's a paid subscription service. Google Fonts is free. So I'll demonstrate that first. The site is google.com/fonts, and it's got this nice interface that allows you to browse different fonts and see what they look like in different contexts. Paragraphs and all sorts of stuff like this, and allows you to search for names or filter by various different attributes or various different types of files. So I have actually used custom fonts in all these examples already. If I just go back to this styling text example I had, even though this font here, my main font that I've kind of used for everything, it looks like a pretty standard serif font. It's actually a custom web font that I've used that I got off Google Fonts called Merriweather, and you notice that if I disable it, it does actually look distinctly different from Times New Roman or whatever the other default would have been. Okay, so my process of getting this was I decided I wanted a serif font for my main body font for my page. So I went to Google Fonts. Okay, I went to Google Fonts and I filtered the categories so that it only showed me serif fonts. Okay, and then I looked at a bunch of these and then picked one that I wanted. This one here, Merriweather. Okay, I can click on it and I can see all of the different variations of that font. Okay, so different font weights and italic or regular. Okay, and you can click on this little pop-out icon here, and it will show you all of the different what we call glyphs, so all the different characters that are available for that font. Okay, and various different information about it and stuff. Okay, but the important one is, in order to actually use this font, once you've decided to use it, you can come down here and click on this button here, which says Quick Use. And what this does is it takes you to a screen which allows you to basically select which of the font variations you want. So you'll notice that actually these different font variations will exist as probably as actually different font files. So if you don't need to use them all, you can save on some download size by not selecting the ones that you're not going to use. Now, given that it's a body font, I'm fairly certain that I'm going to use the normal, and probably at some point I would use the normal italic and also the bold regular font. So I'm going to select those three, and it sort of tells you how much that's going to impact on your page load speed here. But anyway, I select those three, and then when I go down a little bit here, it tells me what I have to do in order to use these fonts in my website. Okay, and because all of the stuff is hosted on Google, I don't actually have to download any fonts or anything. All I have to do is basically link to them where they exist on Google's web servers. So what I select up here will modify basically the text that I need to copy and paste here, but there's essentially three different methods of telling our web page to use this web font. We can do it with JavaScript, which I've never had the need to use the JavaScript method, and then there's these two other ways, standard and import. So essentially both of these point to a CSS file you can see here, and then the options that we selected are specified in query parameters here. But basically they're both pointing to a CSS file hosted on fonts.googleapis.com. The only difference between the standard and import is this first one is you would include this by linking it as a separate CSS style sheet in your HTML document. But the way that I generally do it is using the import statement, which again links to the same CSS file, but rather than putting it as a separate link in our HTML document, if we use this method, so I'll just copy that, I can just go to my style sheet, okay, and I can just place that import statement directly into my style sheet, and it will basically go grab that style sheet and combine the two. So you can see here up the top is where I've included that Merriweather Google font there, and that first import statement. And then the only other thing we need to know is when I'm applying it to a style, what font family name I have to use. Okay, and if I scroll down a little bit further, that's what it tells me here, where it says integrate the fonts into your CSS. So it tells me I have to use font family, and then the name is Merriweather, like that. And then it's generally a good idea to always have a backup font. So what the Google Fonts does is it suggests you a default system font that will exist on everyone's system that looks the most similar to the custom font that you're using. And the reason that you should do that is maybe there's an old browser that doesn't support custom web fonts, in which case it will revert to that one, or potentially because Google is hosting the font files, there may be, for some reason, the Google server might be down and you can't actually access the font files. So rather than showing nothing, it's better off to revert to a font that looks similar to it. Okay, but so this is the font family style I need to paste into my CSS anywhere where I want to use that font, and you can see that's exactly what I've done on the HTML element here. So now Merriweather is my default font style for everything in that document, unless I override it with something else. So that's the method of using Google Fonts to include a custom web font, and that is by far the easiest way. I'd recommend always using that. The only reason you wouldn't use that is if Google Web Fonts doesn't have the font that you want. Now in that case, you do need to do a little bit extra work, but there are still ways around doing it completely manually. So there's this website which I've got linked here off my blog called fontsquirrel.com, and this hosts a whole bunch of free fonts that can be used as web fonts. And actually, this is where I got the font to use for the drop caps example. It was a font called Exotica. So I've got to spell it properly. Okay, so there it is there. So I can click on this to view the font. Okay, and will show me what it looks like in a bunch of different contexts. All right, and now if the font is available for free use, you should see a link here that says Web Font Kit. If you click on this, okay, it will bring up some options here, and basically this is saying which of the file formats that we have for it do you want. Generally, I'd suggest always downloading them all to cover all bases. Okay, and it tells you which font formats work in which different browsers. Okay, and then you just hit download the @FontFace kit, and what it will do is download all of those font files in a zip file for you, which you can then extract, which looks something like this. Okay, so there's the folder there. And these 4 files here are the different font files. Okay, so the same font, but the different formats for each file. It also includes like an HTML page which uses them, which shows you them in a demo. Okay, which is the same page that you look at on Font Squirrel itself. And then specimen files. I don't know, they contain some other stuff to do with that. But really the only files that you need for your site are these 4 files, and then this stylesheet.css file in which they write the font face declarations for you, so you don't have to write them yourself and point to the web fonts. So what I would do is I'd take this folder and I'd copy it across to where my site is. And in my case, I've copied it into this fonts folder there. So there's that particular font there. Okay, and what I need to do is point my page to this style sheet here. Okay, if I look at that style sheet, you can see it's doing a font face declaration and it's defining the font family. So this is the name that I need to use when I style something with this font family. And then you can see here the source is pointing to all of those different files. All of those different font files which are in the same folder. And so what I need to do now is go to my CSS file, okay, and I need to, again, in the same way that I use the import statement to point to the CSS file on Google. In this case, I'm using the import statement to point to the CSS file that's in that font folder that I downloaded. So the only thing you really have to be careful about is making sure you get the relative address correct. So in my project, I've got my CSS files in my CSS folder. So in order to point to this stylesheet.css in that font folder there, I have to go up 1 level, which is what the 2 dots are. So it's go up and then go down into the fonts folder, and then into Exotica Medium Macroman, and then point to the stylesheet.css file. Okay, and now anywhere that I want to use it, which I did with the drop caps, the drop cap style, okay, then I just apply the font family that was defined in that style sheet there, okay, Exotica Medium. Alright, and then that font file will be, or that font will be displayed where I have it styled, like that. Now, just to show that there's nothing particularly magic going on with the Google font version of this, I can even come across and go to my sources panel here. Okay, and this shows you basically everything that's downloaded that goes into building up the website. Okay, and you can see most of this stuff is coming from my local machine here, but there's also been downloading stuff from fonts.googleapis.com, okay, and it's actually this CSS file here, all right, which you can see itself is just a bunch of font face declarations, okay, and because I selected it in a bunch of different styles, okay, it's got a bunch of different font face declarations, and then it's pointing to the font files, but the font files themselves are also hosted on Google's domain. Now, the benefit of this is that if your user, the benefit of using Google Fonts is that if your user has been to any other site on the internet that uses that same font off Google Fonts, then it's already cached on their browser and they don't actually need to download it again. Okay, because web fonts can take up a bit of download, so that's just one extra advantage of using Google Fonts. Now, the final case is that you have a font, but you can't find it on Google Fonts and you can't find it on Font Squirrel either. So let's just say you've got a font on your system, you've downloaded it from some other font site, and you want to use it on your web page, but you don't want to go through the hassle of converting that font file yourself. Font Squirrel has this section of their site called the Web Font Generator, and it's really, really handy. And what you do is you've got your own font, you upload it, so you just select the font file in whatever format that you have, okay, and then you select a bunch of options and then it will convert that for you, create those different file formats for the font, and also create that stylesheet.css for you with the font face declarations, and then it will allow you to download that as the same type of font kit that we downloaded the other one for. Okay, so if you've got a font, you can generate a Font Squirrel web font kit with this section here. The only thing to mention is that even though it won't stop you from doing it, it does tell you that you should be aware that, particularly if there's fonts that you've bought, you usually buy a license for a font, and the different licenses can apply to different uses of it. So you might pay for a license for a font that you can only use it in print work and not web and stuff. But anytime you download a free font, it's generally free across the board, so you're usually pretty right. Okay. Now, the only other thing I've really got here is I've got a couple of links about potential issues, which you can look at if you want, but they're not that major, so I'm not going to bother mentioning them. I've got a link here to Typography CSS framework. So while I've not really used this myself, it is worth mentioning that they exist. So just like we have UI and layout frameworks like Bootstrap and different grid systems, okay, there are CSS frameworks for setting up your typography as well. And there's one here called Typeplate. So that might be worth investigating as well at some point. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today. Are there any questions about any of that stuff?